Just 4 days away from the Grand National Aintree getting underway, but the talk ahead of the race hasn't been about who will win it. It's been dominated by Animal Rising people on national news claiming that races like the National are cartoonish in their cruelty. John is now in the studio to debate whether now really could be the time for horse racing to be banned. Is Orla Coughlin, a spokesperson for Animal Rising, and Rupert Bell, talkSPORT's racing correspondent. Orla, very, very good morning.
Morning, Orla.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Orla, you're an outsider, I have to tell you, in this studio at the moment. So why do you think now is the time to ban, it's not just the National you're talking about, it's horse racing. Why?
I think the tide is changing, and I think the general public are really waking up to the fact that, horse racing, it is cruel. And we are seeing a horse die every other day on British tracks. So I think the general public are ready for this change.
Do you? Yeah, Cheltenham, the crowds at Cheltenham again, fantastic crowds. They clearly disagree with you.
And we saw 2 horses die at Cheltenham as well, and I think that some people do really like horse racing, absolutely. And there is a group of people who will be really disappointed as the sport declines. But we are seeing that the majority of the general public, after our actions last year, when we had a YouGov poll, 54% of the general public thought it was cruel.
Sorry, Rupert, but just before you come in, what about, rather than banning, because it's an industry in its own right, it supports a lot of people, a lot of jobs, a lot of everything. What about just trying to make it, the conversation about trying to make it safer? What about that as an alternative, as opposed to just pushing for an outright ban?
I don't think it's possible to make this sport safe enough. We've seen year on year a horse dying every other day on the British tracks. And if we look at 2015, 2016, there was actually less deaths back then than there is now. So really, this is not something that's declining. And I think it's a PR stunt of the racing industry. They're trying to, make everyone feel like it's safe, but the stats speak for themselves.
Rupert?
Okay, well, some statistics in. There were 90,000 runners in this country last year, and the total deaths was 158, which is 0.2% of all horses that ran. And they have reduced that. There was 112 in jump racing last year, 46 in flat, obviously. But over the recent years, there has been a sharp decline, and there is 47 million pounds worth every year of investment, or has been over the recent years, into welfare. And we've seen the changes at Aintree, which has made marked changes as well to the race. So in
terms of limited runners,
34,
and the fence is not so.
And the trainer from last year, Sandy Thompson, whose horse died at the first fence, he is adamant that the reason the horse died was because of the disruption to the race by Animal Rising. And this horse had never fallen before, and certainly had run well at Aintree prior to this. And the experience leading up to the race was certainly everyone was hyped up and created extra welfare issues by the actions of Animal Rising. And there's no two ways about it. It was a strange experience, and so Aintree have had to sort of look at to manage. And Animal Rising have said that they won't be carrying out any disruption to this year's race, which is a huge relief to all and sundry. But you can't take the risk out of racing. No sport. And I'd basically like to ask you, what do you propose to do with the horses if racing is banned?
Well, I assume that the racing industry, has sufficient funds to care for these horses into a happy retirement. And so what I'd really like to see is a transition away from using horses in sport and allowing them to live free lives, to be wild. I know we don't have any horses in the UK, or very, very few that are wild horses. And I think we're a nation of animal lovers. And I think that's the root of this. We need to kind of reframe the conversation about how we can have horses in the UK without using them and without hurting them.
Do you think the people in the industry don't love their animals?
I really do, and I think we really saw that with Sandy Thompson and how angry he was. And I don't think this is a question of how much they love their animals. I believe that they do love them. But I don't think that they're putting the best interests of those horses at heart. And I would ask you if you think it's acceptable that a horse dies every other day on British tracks.
Look at the statistics, though. It's 0.2%.
If this was a soccer player or a gymnast dying every other day in British sports,
But then,
it would be banned.
there's no life is risky. A horse can break down in the field.
Road traffic, for instance, many people die on our roads. We're not going to ban cars, are we?
but the horses that are racing don't have a choice. And I would like you to answer the question, do you think it's acceptable that a horse dies every other day on British tracks? And if it was a soccer player dying every other day on the British pitches, would that be acceptable?
There's two different things here. You're talking about an industry. There are 18,000 horses who ran last year in this country, of which 158, sadly, lost their lives racing. But that's 0.2%. I keep going back to it. They've reduced it. You're never going to take the risk out of anything. A horse can break down in a field, can wake up this morning. I'm sure the length and breadth of the land, there will be people going into a horse box and finding a horse has broken his leg or done something. It cannot, it's not a risk-free...
They can in the paddocks do it.
Yeah.
It happens, not regular, but it can happen.
But and so this rewilding horses, where are they going to go? I mean, this is where you have to look at. It's an industry that generates £4.1 billion to the rural economy. It's hugely significant. We used to have horsepower. That's what we called. Horse was the engine room for this country. And you have to say that horses have played a significant part. It's a different world now that they're not necessarily used for just working, because obviously we've got the motor car. But ultimately, horses are bred not for the gambling, but because people love the breed and the horse. And that's why my brother's a trainer, he's in the sport because he absolutely loves the horses.
Well, I think it is really difficult. I think the general public are seeing this cruelty. They're seeing the horse die every other day. And I know you talk about, 0.2%. But what that means is a horse every other day. And if this was a jockey dying every other day, there would be a completely different story here.
I can't accept 40-odd% believe that, it's cruel, there should be no racing.
54%, and that's YouGov poll. It's not our research.
I'll be honest with you, I've never met one of these posters. I've never signed one. I've never looked at one. I think it's just garbage, to be honest.
But this year, the Grand National is a sellout on Saturday. 70,000 people still want to go to the Grand National. Thursday's crowd is up as well. So people still want to go racing and enjoy it. There's people, saying attendances are down. Well, we're in a cost of living crisis, so people are concerned about where they're spending their money. But the Grand National had an audience last year of 7 million people watching it, and there will be a similar audience. It's something, yes, and that's why Entry have gone to great efforts to change so much of the race. It's a completely different race than it was 10, 15 years ago. It's much safer, but you cannot take the risk out of anything. If you'd say about soccer players, well, they get some nasty injuries. You can't, what are you saying? Is that right?
Yeah.
So...
It's I mean, look, there's the dementia debate right now in football and head in football, Zola, which Alan and I have done for many, many years. We've seen friends that are all suffering as they get older. But would I go back and do it all again as a young? Yes, I would. Yes, I would. And that's making a very conscious decision. I think that it's
Absolutely.
what you do. And look, there's always the argument. I hear what you're saying. And Al and Rupert, Alan, loves his racing. Rupert's in the industry. But you can't deny that it's so massive and that it's so important to so many people. And that I'm not massively into. I like most people out there go once or twice a year to go and watch. But I've also been lucky enough to go to the stables, and I see the level of care and the level of devotion that is put upon their animals there. And I don't believe they could be any better served if they were running wild down in the New Forest. Honestly, I genuinely don't. I think that they are adored by the people that look after them. So it's very difficult to think that banning that is necessarily gonna make things instantly better.
And where does it stop, Orla? Greyhound racing, fishing, where does it stop?
Yeah, well, that's exactly, what we need to have this conversation about, is that if we are a nation of animal lovers, and if we really, really want to put that relationship to the forefront, I think we need to really seriously consider how we are treating animals, not just in horse racing, but in these other industries as well.
Can I just make one question, Orla, to Rupert? Rupert, is there a case at all in making the fences a little shorter, safer?
They've done that, because if you look at it, the fence now, if you brush through it, basically there's about, I think, 1'6" there's a sort of jump, but the rest is that this brush, which they just knocked down.
Right.
And it's a different type of fence now. It's plastic under, they've made significant changes.
Running rails, plastic.
If you look at the Beecher's Brook to what it was before and now, it's a very different race.
Yeah.
It's still the same. In the last 5 years, 5 horses have died in this Grand National race, and every year they come out with, last year they were painting the jumps to be a different colour for the horse to see,
which they did research
and we
about.
And still Hill 16 died on the very first jump, and millions of people saw that.
And therein lies the theory that the disruption to the race created, and having experienced it, and I was commentating for
It's your fault, Orla.
Well, I'm not saying it's your fault, but it created a tension in the air that was then jockeys got it, the horses would get it, so it created an atmosphere that was could lead to some problem, and sadly it did. And racing, that's why they've made changes to they've changed the standing start, bringing the fence forward so they can't, it's a shorter run to the first fence now, and 34 runners, and so it's a very different race. But would you also want to ban show jumping, dressage, because a horse or eventing? So are you saying all horse sport is bad?
I'd like to just touch on the point that you made before that first, just on Hill 16 dying at that first obstacle, and the fact that death is statistically average for that race. Also, Sandy Thompson said that the horse was really distressed before being put into the race. And my question is, why if that horse was so distressed, why did they make that horse run when they had the choice and the opportunity to say, actually, this horse is distressed, let's not put them into the race? But the reality is that the profit came first, and it is continually coming first.
Some people would say it wasn't just that horse was distressed, there was several, because of what the demonstration before the race
and
started.
They could have stopped the race if they.
No, we don't want to stop the race. That's the whole point.
And that's exactly what I'm saying. Well, 1 second.
Yeah.
This is exactly what I'm saying. Is that Ruby Walsh himself has said that these changes to the race, the new rules, are to ensure the future of the sport. This is about protecting the race, not about protecting horses. And I think until we can have a frank and honest conversation with people in the racing industry who say, I see that this is actually a really big issue, because no one here has acknowledged that a horse is dying every other day, that it is an issue. So it feels like it's not an honest conversation.
Well, Rupert's give you the stats.
Racing is absolutely aware of, there is welfare is so important, and it's across all horse sport. That welfare, if you talk to anyone across all the equestrian industry, they know welfare is paramount, because no one wants to lose a horse. It's just not what they want. But sadly, racing has a risk factor. Flat racing has a risk factor. But when you create a tension in the air through the demonstration that happened here, were we racing? Were we not racing? Jockeys go in, horses get into a natural rhythm before a race. That completely went out the window last year, and that created a tension. And the most experienced jockeys you've got riding, they all know what's going on in a race and can understand. But it changed the dynamic of the race. And unfortunately, Hill 16, Sandy Thompson was very eloquent and absolutely convinced. Now, you will say otherwise, but racing is desperately concerned about the welfare issues and wants to try and make it as safe as possible. But nothing in life is without risk. And if you're saying that you want your horses to be running around the New Forest, I'm sure there are ponies there, and 1 or 2 of them are breaking their legs this morning running around in that free environment. You cannot take the risk, and racing is an integral part of this country. And horses are an integral part of this country.
I've got to leave it here, I'm afraid. Orla, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Orla Coughlin and Rupert Bell.
talkSPORT Breakfast, waking you up Monday to Friday morning from 6 a.m. on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.